Okay, welcome everybody to the Unitarian Church of Los Alamos. Whoever you are, wherever you are in life's journey, whatever you believe in, whoever you love, you are welcome here. Today is our, I think our lecture 30th on the Bible, and we've made it to Deuteronomy, and we're going to try to finish Deuteronomy today if we can. So today should be the conclusion to Deuteronomy. I want to remind everyone that if you're new, there is a class webpage, sites.google.com, view biblical scholarship and literacy. I apologize for the long URL, but I usually try to link these in the video description if you're watching it online. If you're not, there is a QR code. You can take a picture of it, and it should take you to the webpage. The webpage has a syllabus and a calendar. The calendar isn't always updated as much as I'd like, but the syllabus has the readings. It has links to the handouts, anything like that I've used, and links to each of the videos so you can go back in time and watch the old stuff if you'd like. So last time, if you can remember what we did last time, it's been a couple months. Our schedule didn't let me teach last month, but we reviewed what we talked about, the documentary hypothesis, and we added the Deuteronomistic source, D, to our list. So we'd been talking before about J, E, and P, and this time we added D. D doesn't really show up in the Bible until the Book of Deuteronomy. That's why it's labeled, the source is called the D source, because it's primarily associated with Deuteronomy. So even though D is something you'd never seen before, it's going to become incredibly important, because D writes most of the Book of Deuteronomy, and then this tradition or source or whatever it is associated with the Deuteronomistic history, which includes Joshua, Judges, and 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. We call that the Deuteronomistic history, as opposed to Chronicles or Ruth. Ruth is in the writings, and Chronicles is a different, later we think, history of the kings of Israel, written almost in contrast to the history written by the Deuteronomistic history. We believe that the author or school or group that was responsible for this Deuteronomistic history also wrote the Book of Deuteronomy. We talked about the purpose of the book. The book was written probably in the 7th century, either just before or just after the Babylonian captivity, probably when the Assyrians were on the rise. It was, in fact, the most common view is that a lot of it was written before the captivity, when the Assyrians were the major problem, and then it was revised after people were taken into captivity by the Babylonians, who became the real problem, not the Assyrians. But if we believe that's the authorship and date, then what is the kind of theme? The Assyrians would come and they would conquer groups, and if you resisted, they would put you up and impale you on these poles. They were very brutal. They gloried in their war crimes, and the reason they did was to scare people into capitulation. And what you would do is you would make a covenant with the Assyrian king. And the Assyrian king would say, I will do these things. I will protect you. I'll take care of you. And in return, you will be devoted to me and you will keep my laws. And if you do these things, I will protect you. You won't be attacked by me. And not only will you not be attacked by me, I'll be your protector. And so someone at the time when covenanting with the Assyrians was very tempting probably wrote the Book of Deuteronomy, which has a major theme that says, your real king is Jehovah, Yahweh. Covenant with him, not with the Assyrian king. And it structures the book as if it was an Assyrian covenant ritual. So we have these Assyrian texts, and I gave them in a handout last time, which describe how you make a covenant with the Assyrians. And the wording, the language, especially in the Hebrew, right? If you read the Hebrew and these other Semitic texts, they have not just the kind of type of wording, but the verbiage itself is the same, and the structure is the same. And so when you read the Book of Deuteronomy, you find it to be very retributional and transactional. If you will do this for me, I will do this for you. If you break these rules, I will do horrible and gruesome things to you. But that's exactly the way the Assyrian treaties were structured. If you break my rules, I will do horrible and despicable things to you. That's probably where that kind of transactional, horrible, despicable things to you comes from. It's structured like an Assyrian covenant treaty. But its point is, make a covenant with God. He'll really protect you, not the king of Assyria. And of course, during the reign of Hezekiah and the prophet Isaiah, the Assyrians attacked. The people chose to trust in God instead of the Assyrian kings, and Jerusalem survived their assault. So this is probably the context in which this book was written, either before that event or just after that event, kind of glorying in the fact that if you covenant with God, you don't end up with the Assyrians. This is all review. We also said that there's probably a connection to this book of Josiah. Josiah is a couple kings after Hezekiah, and the text of Kings describes finding this book of the law in the temple that Josiah reads. We believe that finding of the book has something to do with the finding of the book of Deuteronomy, and the exact connection is unknown. So that was what we did last time, but I wanted to review to get you kind of back into thinking about this Deuteronomistic source associated with the authorship of Kings, probably associated with Josiah, and the finding of the book, which also is probably the finding of the book of Deuteronomy, also associated with the Deuteronomistic source and Josiah. So last time we gave you the structure of the book. We talked about the contents of the book. We talked about the transactional nature of the book. And I think one of the most important things we said, and I want to say it again in case I wasn't clear enough last time, the Bible contains a discussion about why bad things happen to good people, or why bad things happen at all. And it's very important that you see the book in terms of that discussion, instead of cherry-picking particular verses. Because the book of Deuteronomy's explanation for why bad things happen is, you broke the laws, so you got these bad things happening to you. And again, that's all in the context, I think, of this Assyrian treaty format. And a group of people who are trying to figure out why God allowed the kingdom to be destroyed, or was about to allow, either one, right, depending on when it was written. And again, we think part of it was written before and another part was written after. For the part written after, they're looking back and saying, how could this happen? And their explanation is, we broke the laws, therefore God stopped protecting us, therefore we were destroyed. And we see that show up, every once in a while there'll be somebody on TV who will say, this hurricane destroyed this Florida because Florida broke the commandments of God, right? Something like this. And again, this is a Deuteronomistic approach, retributional approach to why bad things happen. But this text, I think, has to be seen in conversation with other texts like Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes is well aware of the book of Deuteronomy. And Ecclesiastes' lament is, I see the bad people prosper all the time while good people struggle. Why is that, God? And I'm kind of miffed about this whole thing. Because there's the Deuteronomy thing you promised me didn't really work out. So if you read Deuteronomy and you don't read Ecclesiastes, you get the idea that the Bible has an answer to why bad things happen, when in reality the Bible has a communication, a conversation, because it's not sure. The authors of the text aren't sure. We get the book of Job, where clearly a righteous person has horrific things happen to them. And the text does that in conversation with Deuteronomy, and in contrast to Deuteronomy. So again, you have to see the text as a whole and not cherry pick our verses, because when we look at the Bible as a whole, it's got this conversation going on. Today, we've talked about the author, we've talked about the themes, we've talked about some of the words that show up in the Deuteronomy source that don't show up in the others, so you can tell them apart. How does one of them talk? What is the voice? What is their Hebrew inflections? We've talked about all that sort of thing, but we never really read Deuteronomy. And we obviously can't read it all together, but I want to read at least a few selected verses so you've seen pieces of it, and then we'll be done. Interestingly, not only will we be done with Deuteronomy, we'll be done with what's called the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of Moses. It took us 30 lectures, but we're finally done with the first 5 books of Moses, and that's a pretty big milestone. It took us a long time, several years and 30 lectures. All right, so the outline of the text. It starts with a third-person prologue, and then it goes into 3 speeches of Moses. The first speech in 1:6 through 4:43, and then a second speech in 4:44 through 28, and then a third speech, and then a third-person epilogue again. Just like we started with this third-person prologue, and then we have a third person. So there's this third-person framing with these speeches of Moses in the middle, and there's 3 speeches: the historical prologue, the stipulations of the covenant, and then the curses and blessings for obedience. Those are the 3 speeches. Again, structured like an Assyrian treaty ritual. Let's start with the 10 Commandments. That seems like a good place to start, right? So, the 10 Commandments are this famous thing. Everyone says, well, you keep the 10 Commandments. Everyone knows the 10 Commandments. But if you ask people to quote the 10 Commandments, then they start struggling. The other bit is everyone gives you a different number of commandments. And we mentioned this a little bit in the book of Exodus. But the Ten Commandments show up twice, once in Exodus and once in Deuteronomy, and they're not the same. And different groups will divide them up into 10, because there's a tradition. There's 10. Well, really, there's a bunch of verbiage, and you have to divide that into 10, and it's kind of an arbitrary division, and people actually divide it up different ways to come up with 10 things. But the Deuteronomy version of the Ten Commandments starts out a little different. It says, Moses convened all Israel and said to them. Now, again, the story context is a little different. In Exodus, God is giving the Ten Commandments from Sinai, speaking to the people, God's voice speaking from heaven. Here, Moses is speaking to the people just before they go into the Promised Land and reminding them of the Ten Commandments. But when he does quote the Ten Commandments, he quotes them a little different. Again, the general understanding of why they're different is because this is an independent source for this tradition. There was a tradition among Israel, a spoken tradition probably, of 10 commandments that God had given them from Sinai. And when they were written down by two different groups of people at different times, they remembered those words a little differently. And so the differences, I think, sort of speak to the authenticity, not that authenticity, I don't mean that in the sense that God actually spoke from heaven. That's up to you if you believe that. But it speaks to the authenticity of an early oral tradition that is being recorded by two independent witnesses. So it begins, Moses convened all Israel and said to them, Hear, O Israel, the statutes and ordinances that I am addressing to you today, and you shall learn them and observe them diligently. Verse 2 of chapter 5. The Lord our God made a covenant with us at Horeb. This is a key to the Deuteronomistic source. He will always call Sinai Horeb, whereas Exodus in P and J and P, it's Sinai. E, interestingly enough, also calls it Horeb. Let's see. Not with our ancestors did the Lord make this covenant, but with us, who are all of us here alive today. Now, that verse I read to you last time because it's one of the themes of Deuteronomy, and that is this thing that happened in the past, this covenant. It's not with the past. You have to each consider yourself as if you were literally there. I'm going to tell you the story of the Exodus, but you have to imagine or pretend or put yourself in that place because you were literally there. It was like you were there, and God covenanted with you as well. The Lord spoke with you face to face at the mountain, out of the fire, and the time I was standing between you and the Lord to declare the words of the Lord, and you were afraid because of the fire and did not go up to the mountain. And he, the Lord, said, and now we start jumping into the Ten Commandments. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. So again, the covenant formula. Who's speaking? I am the Lord your God. And what did I do for you? I brought you out of the land of slavery. Therefore, because I did this for you, you will have no other gods before me. This is very much like a Syrian treaty. I have protected you. I have defended you. Therefore, you'll have no other kings besides me. You will give fealty to me and me alone. You shall not make for yourself an idol, whether in the form that is like in heaven above and earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or worship them. Again, this is where people start dividing this up differently. Have no other gods before me, is that 1? Not make an idol, is that 2? Not bow down to them, is that 3? This is where you get a little bit of wishy-washy in how people divide this up. I am God, I'm a jealous God, punishing the children for the iniquity of their parents. But I love those who love me for 1,000 generations. You shall not make wrongful use of the name of God, etc., not take the name of the Lord in vain. And then we get the Sabbath day. This one is different. So what I have here is they're all slightly different in their wording, but this one is the biggest difference. And so what I've done is I've put the two next to each other. And we'll read the Deuteronomy one first. Observe the Sabbath day and keep it holy, as your Lord God commanded you. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath of the Lord your God. You shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, or your male or female slave, or your ox or your donkey, or any of your livestock, or the resident aliens of your towns, so that the male and female slave may rest as well as you. Not only do you have to rest, your slaves have to rest too. And then notice why. Remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, and therefore the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day. In other words, this is big for me because a lot of people, especially in kind of the Christian Protestant background that I grew up in, for them the Sabbath is this thing you can't do. Like you can't play, you can't watch TV, you've got to just sit around in church clothes all day and whatever your rules are for keeping the Sabbath. This says Your ancestors were slaves, but you are free. And free people get a day off. Only free people can choose to take a day off, and you get a day off. And you need to give a day off to your workers too. Why? Because you were slaves, I set you free. You're going to treat your workers, your slaves, better than you were treated. You get a day off, they get a day off. It's a very almost a social justice-y justification for why the Jewish calendar has a day off. It's a good thing. You get to rest. You don't have to work. Not a you have to do this, you have to do that, you have to, right? It's very different in its feeling. Now let's look at chapter P. P is more, this is in Exodus, this is the P source. This is more the way the Sabbath was taught to me, which you can't do this because this, right? Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor, do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. You shall not do any work, nor your son, nor your daughter, your male, female, slave, nor your livestock, or your alien resident in your towns. Notice it's a little different. The order is even different. But then it says, 4, why? In 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, but rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the seventh day and consecrated it. In other words, this is this holy space in time, just like the temple is a holy space in place, this is a holy space in time. Therefore you have to keep it holy by not doing fun things. And you can't do all this, you can't work, but you also can't do fun things because you've got to keep this sacred space, this sacred time holy. And the reason is because God created the universe in 6 days and rested on the seventh. It's the 7 days of creation. Which source wrote about the 7 days of creation? P. So of course for P was, we believe, written by priests of the temple who were interested in the rituals of the temple. And so for P, he organizes the creation the same way the temple organizes space, and then he justifies the Sabbath keeping by referring to his creation, his own creation story. D doesn't care about how many days God created the heavens and the earth. For D, it's all about the fact that slaves should have to work. You're free. You don't have to work. So again, we see this difference in voice, in emphasis, and in thoughts, and in theology even. Yeah, go ahead.
So I noticed that in the left one, the Deuteronomy one, it says that you shall not do any work, but then it says your male and female slave may rest as well. So there's one says shall not, and the other one says may, whereas in the Exodus one, it lumps them together and it says none of you shall work.
Yeah.
Does that have any significance that,
yes.
there's a may in there?
Yes, I think so. So what's happening in the Deuteronomy source is when it talks to the people, it says this is what you're going to do. And what you're going to do is not make your slaves work. See, that's the important part. It's talking to you, and you cannot make your slaves work. So it's all about what you do. P cares about ritual purity. So he doesn't care who's doing it. Working on the Sabbath creates pollution, ritual pollution, so no one can work, and you have to stop your slaves from working. See, so indeed, it's a social justice issue. You won't work, and you're not going to make your slaves work either. You're going to be someone who gives them that day off. What they do with it is their own business, but the command to you is to not work and to not make your slaves work. For P, it's you got to make sure nobody works. In fact, if they do, maybe you put them to death because they're polluting the land. And if you pollute the land, God won't live with us. It's this ritual purity issue. So I think even the May has some hint as to the theological thinking of the two authors. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm curious how far this goes, and in particular, there's often a difference between what is expected of women and men. But in either case, are they required to have their food prepared the day before, or things like that?
So are they required to have their food prepared the day before? So when we start doing this, we start talking about later Jewish tradition, because this is the text it's all based on. The question is, how do Jews today interpret this text? And that's a much more complicated story. In fact, one that we should probably get some modern Jewish scholar to come and tell you about. The kosher laws are complicated. I know a little about them, but not enough to speak definitively. One of the things I can tell you is the way that the Talmud, the later Jewish authors, interpreted work, because they got to this thing, and they're lawyers, right? So the Jewish people treated their laws like we treat kind of a constitution, which then has precedent, which sets how you treat the laws and how you interpret them. And the precedents are set in the Talmud, and they have a majority opinion and a dissenting opinion, very much like a Supreme Court ruling. And what they did was they got to this verse and they said, well, what do we mean by work? What constitutes work? There's something we can't do. If you want to keep these rules, what is it that we can't do? And so they took that word work and they noticed that it's the same word used for the service of the temple service. Work, service. I mean, when we get to temple, we translate it service, but when we get to work, we translate it physical labor. But in Hebrew, it's the same word. And they noticed that, and they said, okay, so the sort of thing God would have to do to create the universe is the sort of thing we won't do on the Sabbath. And because creating the temple is a symbolic recreation of the heavens and the earth, it's creating God's heavens on earth, therefore, anything we had to do to make the temple is the sort of thing we won't do on the Sabbath. And then you get into minutiae. Do you spit on the ground on the Sabbath? Well, that's sort of like watering crops, so you can't do that. And Jesus sort of comments on that when he spits on the ground and makes clay and anoints the woman's eyes on the Sabbath and allows her to see and heals her eyes so she can see. With clay he made by spitting on the ground. He's specifically commenting on this Jewish tradition. A lot of Christians will point this out and then they'll use it as a way to mock kind of the Jewish over legalistic view of this law while ignoring its kind of spiritual import. Is kind of the way they would think. And they would think that is a reason they're superior. I don't want to do that. I remember I went to Israel, and I was out on the Sabbath walking the streets of Jerusalem, and an ultra-Orthodox man and his son found us there and said, "Have you had dinner?" And we said, "No." And he said, "Okay, come with me." And he brought us into his house, and he fed us Sabbath dinner. And we had we read the scriptures together. We lit the candle, sang the songs. I think they didn't lit the candle. The candle was supposed to be lit the night before. But anyway, we did the songs and sang and the whole thing. And I remember how much joy he had with Sabbath observance. It was a joyful thing, and he kept very minutiae level. So for him, like, you can't turn on the oven on the Sabbath because that's lighting a fire, but you leave it on the night before. So when you ask how Jews do this, they all do it differently. There are some who don't keep these rules at this level, and there are the Reformed Jews, and there are others that keep them at a very minutiae, fine-tuned level, and some of them really enjoy that. It can be a joyful act for them, and they do this because they want to. Not because they feel like God's going to beat them over the head if they don't. And so it depends, is the answer, I think, to your question. It depends on which Jew you're talking to. In fact, there's the funny story. There was a Jew stranded on a desert island, and I'm telling you this Jewish joke because a Jewish friend of mine told it to me, so therefore I feel like I can get away with that. A Jewish man was stranded on a desert island. He was found 10 years later, and he'd built 2 synagogues, and they asked him why he had not just built 1 synagogue. Why had he built 2? There was only 1 man standing on this desert island. He says, every Jew needs a place he can go worship his God. He says, great, why did you build the second one? Because every Jew needs a synagogue he will not set foot in. And so if you ask this question, my guess is to 2 different observant Jews, you will get 2 different answers. But there is a traditional answer in the Talmud, and I'm not qualified to pull out all the minutiae to that. But anyway, I find the distinction between the version of the Sabbath in Deuteronomy and the version in Exodus enlightening, both in terms of the authors and their different ways of thinking about things. One with a social justice bent, one with a ritual purity bent. And it kind of helps you set up the authors that we've dealt with, and you see them now in the things they're really interested in. Deuteronomy 6 is called the Shema, at least part of it. And Shema means hear in Hebrew. And this is a very famous passage, especially for Jewish people. It's kind of the banner for their constitution almost. This is the passage they will likely quote to kind of summarize their religion. And starting in chapter 6, verse 4, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord alone." Now, some translations will say the Lord is one. Some will say the Lord alone. If you translate it those 2 different ways, you get 2 very different ideas. One is the Lord is one is in contrast to some pagan traditions where their God has different aspects or forms. Our God is one. The other one is the Lord God, our Lord alone. That would imply we don't worship any of these other gods. We don't worship or give fealty to any of these other gods, just this one. And it turns out we actually, I don't think, know the right interpretation of this verse. It could be actually either one. But the NRSV chooses the Lord alone. But then it has a footnote. The Lord our God is one Lord, or the Lord our God, the Lord is one. The Lord is our God, the Lord is one. It gives like 4 different possible translations because it knows that this is a sticky point, and it actually dramatically changes the meaning depending on how you interpret that. And we don't know how to do it. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. The Lord our God is one. You shall love him with all of your heart, might, soul. Now, this is the verse that Jesus quotes as the most important law in the law of Moses. Remember, someone came to him and said, which is the most important law? And he says, this one. Turns out so did Maimonides before him. Maimonides is a very famous Jewish rabbi who gave the exact same answer as Jesus. So it was a readily understood answer at the time. This is the most important law, to love God, and the Lord is one. Keep these words that I'm commanding you today in your heart. Recite them to your children. It's the most important, and you better make sure you don't forget. So recite them to your children. Talk about them when you're at home, when you're away, when you lie down, when you rise. Bind them as a sign on your hand and fix them as an emblem upon your forehead and write them on the doorposts of your gates so you don't forget. And so we get several important Jewish traditions today, which you've probably seen. This is the phylactery or the Tefillin. These are these boxes with this particular passage written on it that they will write in these boxes and then bind them to their hand and their forehead as one of their ritual acts before prayer and in special days. And again, Jesus comments on this point when he talks about making these boxes really big to show off, and then your religious tradition is to be seen by men rather than because you're really devoted to God. So this is another sort of Jewish tradition that shows up again in the New Testament where there's a commentary on this. This is called a mezuzah, and it again contains this passage written on it and then placed upon the posts of a door. Always at a slight angle. There's a reason for that, and I used to know, and now I've spaced it. But there's some interpretation why it has to be placed at a slight angle. And you'll often see Jewish people walk out of the door and they'll kiss their hand and then touch the door as they pass through. This is where that comes from the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, and soul. And then remember, the second commandment comes, surprisingly enough, I think, from Leviticus, because Leviticus gets a lot of flack from people for being, having passages opposed to homosexuality, etc. But that passage says, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And those are the 2 greatest commandments that Jesus quotes. Now, again, Maimonides gave the same 2 lists. What's interesting in the New Testament version is in Luke is that someone then comes to him and says, and who is your neighbor, Lord? And the text says, wishing to justify himself, he asks this question. Well, it turns out there was a long conversation about who is your neighbor in Jewish tradition. And the reason is because the text right before love your neighbor as yourself has this conversation about the stranger and the neighbor. And then it says, and love your neighbor as yourself. It could have said love them both as yourself, but it didn't. It said love your neighbor as yourself. And so one of the interpretations you could give to this is God isn't asking us to love our enemy. That would be too hard. He's just asking us to love our neighbor, the people who live next to us, our fellow Jews maybe. So it could be interpreted as those who live next to us. It could be interpreted our fellow Jews as opposed to the Gentiles. We don't have to love them. Or it could be interpreted as everybody. Now, does anyone remember? I know this isn't a New Testament class. We'll get to this later, but at the rate we're going, it might be 20 years from now. So does anyone remember what comes next? The man asks, well, who's my neighbor? And Jesus, in the context of all these various interpretations, Jesus says, there once was a man who went down from Samaria, and he tells the story of the Good Samaritan. And to put that in modern context, what Jesus said is there was a Russian who went down through Ukraine, and he found a Ukrainian soldier lying on the side of the road bleeding. This is the emotional impact that the story would have had for a Jew hearing it, right? This is the bad guy. This is your enemy. and he came down and found one of you, the people you think are your neighbor, lying on the side of the road, and he took care of him. In a time when other Jews had walked past this man, this stranger came and took care of him. And they said, who was a neighbor to this man? Notice, a neighbor isn't who lives with you. He says, who was the neighbor? The neighbor is the one who behaves a certain way. And he says, well, clearly the Samaritan was the neighbor. And then Jesus says, go and do that likewise. So Jesus' answer to this question, who is your neighbor, is everybody. Okay, so what we have is this passage, love the Lord your God with all your heart, might, and soul. And then the second is in Leviticus, love your neighbors yourself. Maimonides and Jesus both are ascribed to have said these are the two most important commandments in all the law. I also want to make one other point. We tend to think about this love the Lord as an emotional reaction. The verbiage used here also shows up in Sumerian treaties with their kings. And so in that context, it means more like devotion. Be devoted to the law, to the king, almost like we would think of patriotism. Be patriotic to your king, to your ruler, and keep his commandments. Be fully devoted. So it may, I know this kind of throws some cold water on some of our old favorite worship songs about loving God and stuff, but in this context, this passage in Deuteronomy probably has more to do with devotion and keeping the law, because again, it's borrowed from the Sumerian thing. All right, let's skip to Deuteronomy 17 to give you another kind of idea of the sort of stuff that shows up in Deuteronomy. If we start in verse 14, when you come into the land that the Lord is giving you, and I will set a king over me like all the other nations around me. That is a direct quote from what shows up in Kings, where they say, make us a king like all the other nations around us, and they create Saul. And when you indeed set a king of the Lord over you, who God will choose, one of your own community may set king over you. You are not permitted to put a foreigner over you who is not of your community. In other words, you can't have the Assyrians as a king. That's actually against the commandments. You have to have a Jewish person as a king. Very much like we say, to be a president, you have to have been born in the U.S. That's actually a requirement. Even so, you must not acquire many horses for himself, or return the people to Egypt in order to acquire more horses, since the Lord has said to you, you must not return again that way. And you must not acquire many wives for himself, or else his heart will be turned away. In the verse 20, he will not exalt himself over other members of the community, nor turn aside from the commandments, either to the right or the left. The king is not better than anyone else. That's a very interesting thing. That is not normal for the ancient Near East. Now, I like to talk about these verses, or these texts, the Bible. I like to talk about it in terms of an arc of history bending towards justice. Like, I don't read this text and say, this is the way things should be. But I do often read this text and say, it's got horrible things in it, but it's got this interesting step forward from the people around them. Not only in the times of the Bible, but in the times that followed, the king was not like everyone else. He was exalted above others. In fact, the Babylonian king and the Assyrian king will talk about how they are gods. And so the Israelite author is looking at the Assyrian king, who thinks he's a god, and writing, the king shall not exalt himself above other members of the community, nor turn aside from the commandments to the right or the left, so that he and his descendants may reign long over the kingdom of Israel. Notice also he snuck in an explanation for why they didn't reign forever. The Babylonians destroyed them. Why? They didn't keep the commandments. This is that transactional nature. So there's a transactional element to this, but there's also this very interesting commentary on kingship. The king is not a god. The king is not superior to the people. The king is there to serve the people and is not this exalted being over the people. And it's also interesting, the list of things that the king is not allowed to do. When the Deuteronomistic historian gets to Solomon, he will list every single one of those things. Solomon did everything he was not supposed to do, to the letter. And it's this passage that he's violating. Every one of them, he has multiple wives, he has multiple horses, and it just lists everything he's not supposed to do here and says Solomon did it. And then that is kind of the explanation for why the kingdom breaks up under his son. Okay, let's go to, we're almost the end. There's only 34 chapters here, I think. 34 or 35? 34. We're almost there. 32. 32 and 33 are very interesting because we've passed the three speeches of Moses, And then we move into this third-person narration again, and in the middle of that third-person narration, we break into a few poems, and it will say, Moses said, and it will give a poem. So, for example, chapter 32, verse 1 says, Give ear, O heavens, and I will speak. Let my earth hear my words of my mouth. May my teachings drop like rain. I'm sorry, let me back up. Chapter 31, verse 30 should be in the chapter breaks are kind of in the wrong place. Moses recited the words of this song to the very end in the hearing of the whole assembly of Israel, Give ear, O heavens, and I will speak. Let the earth hear my words of my mouth. Okay, and then we go into this poem that supposedly Moses spoke. What is interesting about this is this poem does not appear to be from the D source. The verbiage is different, and in fact, the Hebrew is much older. I always like to use this example if I were to say, man, that's bad, I'm writing, probably was written in the 80s. You can kind of tell when something was written from the way that the words are used. The Hebrew here is much older than the rest of the text. Now, is it possible that someone is imitating Old Hebrew? Yes. Why didn't they do that through the rest of Deuteronomy when Moses is supposed to be speaking, if that was what happened? It's much more likely that we have here a song that was therefore remembered. So this is old, we think, much older than the rest of the text. In fact, a lot of biblical scholars will say this song and the one that follows after are two of the oldest things in the entire book. And so here we have a hint at some of the oldest of Israelite religion. And it gets really interesting in verse 8 and 9. This is how the NIV translates 8 and 9. And I want you to look at this verse and try to make sense of it, because actually it makes no sense. But remember the days of old, consider the generations long past. So just think about something that happened long, long ago. Okay? Ask your father and he will tell you, your elders, and they will explain it to you. And if you don't get it, ask your elders, because they know. When the Most High, El Elyon, gave the nations their inheritance, when he divided all mankind, he set up boundaries of the people according to the number of the sons of Israel. For the Lord's portion is his people, Jacob his allotted inheritance. What in the world does that mean? Can you make sense of that last part? I mean, go ahead and try for a minute. I can just go on, but try to make sense of it. When Elyon gave the nations their inheritance. Nations are the people. So he gave, probably this has something to do with, he gave people places to live, each nation a place to live, maybe. And he divided all mankind and set up boundaries for the people according to the, okay, so he's dividing the people according to the numbers of the sons of Israel. But the sons of Israel don't rule all the people. The number of the sons of Israel might explain how he divided up the children of Israel, gave them this much land because they were going to have this many children. In fact, if you're trying to say this is the 12 tribes being divided, fine. But he's dividing all mankind. This makes no sense. And then it says the Lord's portion, Yahweh. So Yahweh had a chunk of this that was his, and his chunk was Jacob. Jacob was Yahweh's inheritance. What does that have to do with dividing up according to the number of Israel? It makes no sense. Okay, the first hint as to what was going on here comes from the Greek. The Greek translation is called the Septuagint. It was translated very early. It's very old. It had later revisions, but every once in a while it will preserve an older reading of the text. So it's not Hebrew, it's Greek, but it's a translation of an older Hebrew manuscript that no longer exists, and therefore sometimes we get hints of what's going on. Notice the difference. When Elyon divided the nations, when he separated the sons of Adam, mankind, by the way, in Hebrew, man and Adam are the same word, so this sort of makes sense. But he's dividing up the sons of Adam. He set the boundaries of the nations according to the number of the angels of God. In Hebrew, angels of God is always Ben Elohim, the children of God, Ben Elohim. And in early Hebrew tradition, these are the angels, the sons of God. And so God has a heavenly court where there's God and he has his children, the Ben Elohim. This passage actually makes sense, but it is theologically challenging to traditional readers of the Bible and monotheism, because what it's implying is that each of God's angels got a nation. Does that make sense? And his people, Jacob, became the portion of Yahweh. So all of his children got a nation, but Yahweh got Israel. But he gave the other nations to his kids. Almost like Baal is real, or Marduk. Let's do Marduk. Marduk is real, right? Marduk is the king of Babylon. It's not like Marduk doesn't exist for this passage. Marduk is real. Marduk is one of the angels, and Marduk is in charge of Babylon. But Yahweh, he's in charge of Israel. Yahweh got Israel, but the other nations got his kids. His kids got the other nations, but God kept Israel to himself. That's the idea here. Israel is the line of his inheritance. And then we found the Dead Sea Scrolls. Do you want to make a comment before I do the Dead Sea Scrolls? Because this is where it gets to us.
As I read it, according to the number of the angels of God, it would almost sound like,
One nation for each of his angels.
no, that, yes, but no. That, okay, let's say there's 10 angels. There's going to be 10 nations on,
Yes.
on the face of the earth, and mine is one of them. And it's like an explanation for why is there Egypt, why is
Right.
there Syria, so forth. And not that the angels rule over them, but this is an explanation for why God chose 10 nations to have all of them.
Right. This is why there are these nations, because there were this many angels, and each angel got a kingdom. But that last part, each angel got a kingdom, is the only reason there would be one kingdom for each angel. And what the reason we jumped there is because that is the standard polytheistic interpretation. Is there's each God rules over each sub-kingdom. Each God is real, they all exist, but each one is ruling over each kingdom. So the reason I jumped that is because in that context, this is what all the people around Israel believed. You wouldn't say something like this without clarifying if you weren't trying to imply that, because that's what everyone else believed. It looks an awful lot like polytheistic pagan stuff. And then we found the Dead Sea Scrolls, which is a much older variation of the Hebrew. And the NRSV is translation. I can't just give you the Dead Sea Scrolls, right, because you don't read Hebrew. But the NRSV is translated and follows the Dead Sea Scrolls in its interpretation. So let's read that one. Starting verse 8, when the Most High apportioned the nations, divided up the nations, apportioned them, he divided humankind, and he fixed the boundaries of the peoples according to the number of the gods. Period. Not the sons of God, not the angels, not Israel, the gods. And the Lord's own portion was his people, Jacob, his allotted share. This gets even weirder because when Elyon did this, Elyon is the Canaanite chief deity. So, this is normally interpreted as when God, using one name for God, did this. He gave these many to the number of Israel, the number of his angels, but he kept this for himself. Now, the Lord's own portion, notice that own portion. Why did they put own in there? The Lord's own portion? Well, because they were trying to make sure you don't get confused and think that Elyon and Yahweh are different people. It's the Lord's own portion is this. Problem is, own is not in the Hebrew. It's not there. They made that up. The Lord's portion was Jacob, his allotted inheritance. This is a polytheistic statement. I don't think there's any other way to read it. Elyon is the chief god of the Canaanites. Yahweh is the chief god of Israel. And Elyon divided up the nations, and he gave Yahweh Israel as his people. And why are we not worshiping other gods? Because Yahweh, this is Yahweh. We're Yahweh's people. Not the other gods don't exist. We're Yahweh's people. That is almost certainly what this passage means. And so what we probably have is a song that preserves a very old Jewish tradition before they were monotheists. When they were still worshiping, believing in other gods, but worshiping only Yahweh. That was the stage. So they started out pagans worshiping lots of gods. Then they believed in lots of gods, but only worshiped Yahweh because we're his portion. And then they moved to not believing in other gods. And so this is one of those really impressive passages that preserves this much older tradition. And so we believe the Dead Sea Scrolls is the authentic. So what we have is late Hebrew, the Masoretic text, says the children of Israel. The Greek text says the sons of God, and the very old Hebrew text, which is probably the most accurate ancient version, says the gods. So how did this happen? Well, some Jewish scholar was copying this down. Some Israelite, I don't even want to say Jewish, right? They're not Jewish at this point. Some ancient Israelite Hebrew scholar is copying this passage. He gets to this thing, and by now they're monotheists. And he says, this is bad. According to the number of the gods. He means the sons of God, clearly, because he thinks Elyon is Yahweh. He's assuming they're the same person by now, because Elyon and Yahweh have merged. So he says, we'll just say the sons of God. right? Why did he do that? Well, the sons of God makes sense. Now there is God, and he's giving these other nations to his children, his angels. But it's God the Father of all that is our deity. Yahweh and God the Father are the one. That's that first stage, and that's the stage preserved now in the Septuagint, the Greek. Then what happens? Some later Jewish scholar doesn't even like the idea that angels rule over other nations, because that implies the pagan gods are God's sons and they're angels and they're real, and he doesn't even like that, because at this point they're not even real. And so what he does is he says, well, sons of God, what are the sons of God? I'm just going to clarify. Israel, we are God's children, right? So sons of God must not be referring to the angels, God's sons. It must be referring to us. We are the sons of God. So he replaces sons of God with Israel as a clarification so that no one misreads this passage and dares to think that there's more than one God. And so this is how this probably evolves into this late reading, which shows up even in modern Bibles like the New International Version. Yeah?
Could you go back to that previous slide?
Which one? This one?
The one that we were just looking at a second ago.
This one?
Okay, yeah. So, do you know what word the Dead Sea Scrolls use for gods there?
Elohim.
Okay. So it's been a while since I looked at this, but
Yeah.
you have at least in Genesis 2.
I apologize. Ha Elohim.
Right?
So, yeah.
And one of them we attribute right to the E source.
Yes.
And the other one to the J source.
Well, sorry. No, one is P and one is J.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so, and then there, one of the ones that refers to Elohim as the agent of creation, which is God. Right?
Yeah. Elohim.
Now, do you have any knowledge of chronologically how that use of Elohim there compares to the origin of Elohim in this sense? Do you know
Yeah,
what
I think so. I can.
Whether the sort of world that both of these stories are reflecting, are they chronologically similar so that it's pointing to a point when people were thinking of, when they hear Elohim or the host of heaven or these sorts of things, that they're thinking of this as not one guy doing the whole thing, but you have sort of a committee of powers doing the same thing. Is this something that had existed at one point and then it went away and people started to make these changes like you're saying? Or is it that this is one tradition that existed over a span of time, and you see it showing up, say, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, you see it showing up in the Book of Genesis, but it's not something that was there and went away, but something that was always there, that was in tension with the notion that there's actually only one God who did the whole thing?
Okay, so I think I can do this. Problem is that's a whole class worth, but let me see if I can try to do a short version of this. El and Elyon are both Canaanite names for a Canaanite deity, the Canaanite father god. Yahweh seems to be the name of a warrior god from the south. What happens in and Elohim also is just plural gods, but it also can just mean God in general. So in Canaanite language, you will often say things like Elohim Baal, and what they mean there is Baal the god. Elohim can be general term for God, or it can be the name of this one God. So already we have this idea that it can be both a name and a general term for God in the earliest versions of the language, not the Bible, but just the language, because we have examples of Canaanite texts from before the Bible. And that's how they use the terms. What seems to happen is when the Hebrew people come into Israel, their God, Yahweh, merge with El. And Yahweh and El become the same person. This poem has an earlier form before they merge, where El, Elyon, the Most High, apportions the nations and gives one to Yahweh, Israel to Yahweh. This is a hint of pre-merger two deities here. But eventually those two deities merge, and now there's El and Yahweh, and those are just an Elohim. Those are all just names for the same thing. Yahweh, Israel's God. That's why we have Israel. It's a reference to that El. And we also have We have these lots of names with Yah in them. These are, I say Yah, these sort of things. This is a reference to Yahweh. Okay, so now we have these beings merged. Then there becomes a tradition about, because people remember calling him El before, and then suddenly now that they're Yahweh and they're the same thing, and there's this kind of memory of this separateness that they have to explain. And the oldest versions of this story, not the oldest, but some of the versions of this story, like the one preserved in E and the one preserved in P, both have this concept that God was called El until the days of Moses. So in P and in E, they will always use the term El. They will never use the term Yahweh until the days of Moses. And then suddenly, both of them have a story. There's two stories, one from P and one from E, where God comes to Moses and says, oh, by the way, my name is Yahweh. I know no one knew my name before now, but it was Yahweh all along, and now my name is Yahweh, so you're going to call me Yahweh from now on. So this is this idea that El becomes Yahweh. It was always the same person for this story, right? For them, it was always the same person, but Elohim becomes Yahweh. During the days of Moses, because God comes down and reveals his name to Moses. His true name is Yahweh. J has no such story. So J uses Yahweh all the way through. And so this is why when you have a creation story from J, it will use Yahweh. P will not do that, because for P, Yahweh's name isn't known until much later. So all of them use Yahweh, but E and P won't use it until after Moses gets the name revealed to him. And then they will switch to Yahweh. D also seems to have no distinction, although D is about a story in the life of Moses. So we don't know what D thought about when Yahweh's name was revealed. But the D tradition, it's Yahweh, because by then Moses knows God's name. But so D will use El and Yahweh interchangeably, and there's no real distinction. But here we have an older poem. This isn't D anymore. This is an older poem preserved by D, which seems to almost hark back to that time when these were separate beings. And this is why we think that, right? This passage informed a lot of the story I just told you, because we know Canaanites had these separate beings. I mean, the Canaanite version of this story is Elyon apportioned the nations and gave Baal Canaan. The Canaanites became the children of Baal. But Elyon apportioned the nations and gave Canaan to Baal. And if you're in Babylon, it's Marduk. Marduk got Babylon. And so here we have the same story. Elyon, a separate being, divides up the nations and gives Yahweh to Israel, or gives Israel to Yahweh. So again, this is one of those major hints of what's going on and how this thing evolved the way it did. This in conjunction with the earlier Canaanite stories. You have to put them all together, right, to make sense of what just happened. All right, the other one is in Deuteronomy 33. I'm sorry, did that answer your question, or did I know there's more? We can talk about it after if you want, because this story goes on and on and on. There's a lot here. Deuteronomy 33 is another one of those hints, because it tells us where Sinai is, and this is one of the only places where the term Sinai shows up in the book of Deuteronomy. Remember, D source always uses Horeb for the Mount Sinai. E uses the same name, by the way. So for E and D, the mountain is called Mount Horeb. Suddenly in Deuteronomy 33, in a poem, which again has really old Hebrew in it, Sinai shows up. And again, what we think has happened is Deuteronomy 33 is preserving another one of these ancient poems, just like Deuteronomy 32. But this one preserves information about where Israelite worship of Yahweh comes from. This one says, this is the blessing which Moses, the man of God, blessed the Israelites. By the way, in this blessing, he will go through each of the 12 tribes and give them each a blessing. But the preface to this is what's interesting. Before his death, the Lord came from Sinai and dawned from Seir upon us, the shores of Mount Paran. With him were myriads of holy ones at his right, a host of his own. Indeed, O favored among his peoples, all the holy ones were in your charge. They marched at your heels, accepted direction from you. What just happened? These places, Seir, Sinai, Mount Paran, these are all references to places in Arabia to the south, near Midian. And remember we said about Moses shows up in Midian, and we also know there was a god named Yahweh in Midian. And Moses shows up in Midian and marries a Midianite priest's daughter, and suddenly he gets this revelation on a mountain where God, this is the P in Easter we just talked about, where P&E, where he says, by my name, I was known to your fathers as El, but by my name Yahweh was I not known to them. And suddenly Moses is conflating a Canaanite god, Yahweh, with an Israelite god, El, and says, oh, by the way, that's the same being. That would put Moses in Midian, and that puts him in the south. And this passage envisions the coming of worship of Yahweh from the south to the north, from Midian, from the south, marching to the north with God and a whole host of angels who are the holy ones, and a host of armies to capture the north. And the favorite among his peoples and his holy ones were in your charge. God gave his angels to you as warriors to help you capture the north. This is this vision of God as a marching army from the south, where Mount Sinai is, to the north, where they capture the nations. This is probably some sort of, an authentic remembrance of how the worship of Yahweh came to Israel. As it came from the south. There were some southerners who worshipped Yahweh. They came here probably in some sort of a war footing. There was some fights, and suddenly their God merged with our God, and we all worshipped Yahweh. So there's probably some memory of where Israelite worship came from. So this is one of those very important passages, I think, because it preserves the origins of Israelite worship of Yahweh. I think that's a big deal. And then we get to the end. And it's taken us 30 lectures, but we're finally to the death of Moses and the end of what we call the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, or what we call the Law of Moses. And this is how it ends. Chapter 34, let's start in verse 5. Then Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab at the Lord's command. God had commanded that he would die and not enter the land, if you remember. Right? He had sinned, so he couldn't enter the land, but he could see the land. He comes up on top of Mount Nebo. He looks over the land, sees it all, and he dies just as God commanded would happen. And he was buried in a valley in the land of Moab opposite Beth Peor, but no one knows his burial place to this day. By the way, he was buried. It says he buried him, and I don't know why the New Revised Standard Version chooses to say he was buried, but it actually literally says he buried him, and the previous thing was by the Lord's command, so it probably is implying that God buried Moses, and that's why no one knows where he's buried, because God buried him, and his burial place is hidden. If you go to Israel, you can actually go to the tomb of Moses, and it's not, right? But it's this traditional place where Moses was supposedly buried. No. Even the people here didn't know where Moses was. But no one knows his burial place. To this day, we mentioned this last time, but this is just a big deal. The to this day only has force if this text was written a long time later. This was not written in Moses' day. It was not written by Moses, not written in Moses. This is someone years later looking back and saying, this is what we think Moses said. And no one knows his burial place to this day. And Moses was 120 years old when he died, and his sight was unimpaired, and his vigor had not abated. That's pretty impressive to live that long and still, have your vigor, whatever that means. And the Israelites wept for Moses in the plains of Moab 30 days, and then the period of mourning for Moses was ended. And then we get Joshua, the son of Nun, was full of the spirit of wisdom because Moses had laid his hands on him, and the Israelites obeyed him, doing as the Lord had commanded Moses. Never since has risen a prophet in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. He was unequaled for all the signs and wonders the Lord had sent him to perform in the land of Egypt against Pharaoh and all his servants and the entire land. And from all the mighty deeds and all the terrifying displays of power that Moses performed in the sight of all Israel, the end. And then we get Joshua chapter 1, verse 1. After the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord spake to Joshua. And the story moves on into what we call the Deuteronomistic histories. The story of Joshua, Judges. It does not Ruth. Ruth was a different source. And then 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd Kings. And this will tell the story of Israel after. I know this is like this big deal. If you're interested in some further reading, Wikipedia is not a good place to go if you want, authentic, good new research, but dang it, it's got some good summaries. I read these and they're not wrong. At least they weren't. They get changed all the time. But when I read them, they're pretty darn good. You can got the Book of Deuteronomy, the Deuteronomist history, the documentary hypothesis, Josiah in the Book of the Law. If you read those things, you'll get kind of a summary of a lot of the stuff we talked about, the origins of Deuteronomy. It's there. It's not, the scholarly source I would go to, but it's a good place for a beginner who wants to just kind of get a feel for it. But if you also want a good source, the Bible for Normal People, especially if you happen to be a believer, again, whatever you believe, whoever you love, you're welcome here. But if you happen to be a liberal believer who believes in God, but wants to know kind of the historical context of the Bible and some of its imperfections, a version that looks at the imperfections with full in the face and doesn't shy from them, but somehow maintains faith. If you happen to be looking for that, the Bible for Normal People is a wonderful source, and Season 2, Episode 39, has Understanding Deuteronomy and the Story of Israel's Kings. And this is mostly about the Deuteronomistic histories. But Season 6, Episode 218 is Pete Ruin's Deuteronomy. He has an episode on Pete Ruin's Exodus, Pete Ruin's Joshua. So those are kind of his series where he goes through and talks about each book. This one is good and relatively useful. I got some of the stuff I've shared just from that. But he also ruins Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Isaiah, Joshua, Judges, and he's even got 1st and 2nd Samuel now if you want extra credit.
Where is that from?
This is the Bible for Normal People, and if you Google that, you will find the podcast.
It's a podcast.
Yeah. Jared Bias and Pete Enns run it, and they have this tongue-in-cheek, the only God-ordained podcast on the internet, which is making fun of evangelicals. They don't really, anyway. But if you really want, if you want to dive into a more scholastic approach, rather than Wikipedia or the podcast, this is the place to go. Richard Elliott Friedman, The Bible with Sources Revealed, has an introduction to the sources, because now that we're done with the Pentateuch, we're done with these kind of sources for the most part. We'll talk about the Deuteronomistic history, but JEDP, all that stuff, if you want to really dive into that, this has an introduction, like 3 chapters that describe that in great detail and does a much better job than I ever could of laying out the evidence for why we believe in these sources. And then it has the text of the Pentateuch color-coded by source. So you can just read each source independent of the others and see how coherent of a story that makes. Very impressive stuff. If you're interested in those Caesarean tree formulas that we went through, Pritchard has the Egyptian and Hittite copies of those treaties that you can compare to the Book of Deuteronomy, both in their language and in their content and in their structure. This book is very expensive, but you can probably find it in a library, or you can borrow mine if you desperately want to. I also happen to make a handout of some of the more interesting ones from both Pritchard and David B. Wesley's Guild Structure and Political Allegiance. Turns out they have the same structure for their initiation covenants that the Hittite ritual formula has. This actually has some bearing on Freemasonry and other sorts of really fun stuff. So I've got this handout if anyone's interested in it. Again, there's a link here which I can put on my drive. It will be in the class notes. If you go to the syllabus, you can find this if you're looking for it. You can also take this picture. There is a QR code, and that'll give you the handouts. Now, next time, I'm going to jump into the fire pit. We had some discussion last time about in the last committee meeting about how I used to teach comparative religion, right? I would teach Bible, and then I would teach comparative religion. I taught 2 classes a month, and it was too much. I just could not do it. It was killing me. And so I switched to 1, and I just did the Bible, and the reason for that is it felt like it would be too long between classes if I'm going to teach one class that builds on the other if I switched back and forth. And that meant we haven't done comparative religion in over a year. And that's too bad, and I want to go back to it. But now that we're done with the Pentateuch, what I'm going to do is I'm going to teach like 1 book of the Bible, and then we'll have a class or 2 on 1 comparative religion topic, and then we'll jump back. So I'm going to go back to comparative religion. I'm going to do that in a way that's probably going to jump myself into the fire pit because I've been wanting to talk about atheism for a long time. And talking about atheism in a comparative religion class is fraught with difficulty because if atheism is a religion, then not collecting stamps is a hobby. Sometimes this is said, if atheism is a religion, then not playing golf is a sport. We got lots of variations of this, and they have a good point. And I am not interested in that debate. That debate is primarily between theists and atheists, and what it is theists want to present atheism as one more religion, and atheists want to present themselves as something very different, We're non-religious. We're not just one more religion. And that is part of that God, no God debate, and I'm not interested in it. Like, whatever you believe, whoever you love, you're welcome here, and I'm not here to critique. I'm here to understand. I want to approach this from a sociological or anthropological perspective. And in that perspective, we sort of do treat atheism as a religion, not because we're taking sides in that other debate, but because we've got survey results, right? Where we've got Mormons, evangelicals, Protestants, Catholics, atheists, agnostics, and you can take those survey results and you want to be able to say something about the subset who answered atheist. And so that's one of the answers on what is your religion. And again, I'm not trying to take sides in this other debate. I just want to answer some interesting questions about history. Who were the first atheists? Do we see them in Greek philosophy? What do they? Who are some of the great atheist philosophers? What did they say and what arguments did they use? Who were the modern atheists like Daniel Dennett, Richard Dawkins? What did they say? Where did they come from? And then what can we say about, like, from surveys, about the number of atheists, how many there are they growing, are they shrinking, and are they more educated, less educated? So we want to kind of dive into the sociology and the sort of things we can say from surveys. And again, I know this isn't going to be controversial, but I don't want it to be. Like, from my perspective, I'm not interested in the controversy. I'm interested in just explaining, understanding one more group, just like we did with Buddhism, just like we did with Mormonism, just like we did with, we want to talk about this group and discuss them. And then we'll move on to something like Taoism and things that we haven't yet covered. So that's what we'll do next time. I think it'll be next month. It may not be. We have some other stuff going on. And again, scheduling, we'll find out. If it's canceled, I'll try to give you as much notice. But we'll... It is. It's the fourth Sunday. I think that's what it is on the schedule. And so that's when it'll be, unless I have some scheduling conflicts with my family. And if I do cancel, I'll try to give people plenty of notice in the email group thing. Any final questions, comments, thoughts before we quit? Anyone?
Thank you.
All right. Thank you. I'll see you next month.